Chapter 2. As Princess Fear grew older, the court saw her beauty and grace more, and her less. And so it was that they taught her what to value, as tribal fashions came and went, feeding her cravings for their betterment, if not her own. "What a beautiful dress, Princess Fear, and you wear it so well." Praise became more refined around her, tailored to her taste, a new-found appetite that required nourishing. "I am left speechless, Princess. Such fabric would diminish most women. On you it appears to have discovered its purpose." And Trophea, who had once blushed beneath admiration, slowly began leaning toward it, without entirely noticing she had moved. And soon she no longer knew whether she liked a ribbon until someone else had admired it. The Queen noticed. Queens noticed leaning, particularly in structures they had spent years attempting to keep upright. The danger announced itself during one winter, when beautiful things were in short supply, unless you had the eyes and ears of Trophies. And so the ones remaining received even more compliments. The Valadorian ambassador, Lord Merrick, was an older diplomat, not unhandsome, with silver hair, perfect manners, and the patient smile of a man who had spent 40 years learning how to use words to find human fault lines. He lavished Trophea with words, some of them praise, some of them reprimand, and seemed to cast spells with them, beguiling, testing, teasing her and her ladies-in-waiting alike, playing them one against another right to the brink of propriety, and then, smiling, safely down again. Then, one evening, passing a gallery by chance, the Queen saw the ambassador adjust a loose curl beside Trophea's cheek, and paused in the gloom to watch, and if need be, guard. There the princess sat, framed by an open arch, on one side light and cold from the winter courtyard, on the other a pretended warmth. A tiny gesture, intimate, without permission. The princess recoiled slightly, and for one brief moment the Queen felt relief. Then the ambassador spoke, quietly, to her ear, not apologizing, correcting. A remark so slight it barely disturbed the air, perfectly chosen, perfectly studied. A crippling criticism, wounding because it struck flesh already hollowed to receive it. Trophea's posture altered at once. The light within her seemed suddenly uncertain, and then the Queen understood, for her daughter's very being was now only scaffolded by his praise, and with the smallest withdrawal of it, he could make her bend. So she turned toward him, pleadingly, imploringly, already willing to barter pieces of herself for the return of approval. Not because Trophea loved him, though she had already begun telling herself that perhaps she did. Not because she trusted him, for his attentions came and went like sunlight through leaves, and she had already begun arranging herself beneath their return. But because admiration, administered patiently enough, had produced need, and where there is need in only one direction, control soon follows. "Please," she whispered, "I shall not disappoint you again." The Queen stood frozen, horrified, mortified, and had there been a sword in her hand, blood might well have flowed there amongst the cloisters, and later across many a field. But queens possess methods far sharper than swords for removing troublesome pieces from the board.
The court saw beauty, not the maid, and praised her silks and grace. She learned to see herself through eyes that smiled upon her face. Lord Merrick spun his silver words to lift and then withdraw. One whisper bent the princess low and showed the queen the flaw. For praise can bind with silken thread, and hunger dresses love. She begged him for the words he stole. She bent to win the words he stole, of fear and not a love.
Chapter 3. For Telios, it began with music. Not dramatic music. Not the sort written to accompany wars, coronations, or people dying beautifully for symbolic reasons, which are just pretty pictures pretending to be words. Simply music that seemed, for reasons Telios could not explain, to leave enough room inside itself for breathing, for being. He first heard the harpist during a recital at dinner. The melody drifted faintly through the dining room, threading itself between arguments and tables with equal skill. Sounds which he found far more appealing than words about border levies and whether poor people were becoming unreasonably committed to remaining alive during winter. Telios found himself listening, and then staring, more than was probably polite or wise, for he spilled the wine from his goblet several times, as well as once spearing a bishop when they both sought the same roast quail for their plates. This disappointed the queen slightly, not because she disliked music. Queens generally approve of music, provided it understands its place and knows when to stop. Later that evening, under the entirely fictional pretext of wishing to improve his cultural education, Telios sought out the musician responsible. Her name was Illyrica. She lived in the old Western music tower, where the acoustics were excellent and the heating mostly sotto voce. She was older than he expected, having only ever seen her from afar. Yet somehow she still seemed to shine. Old enough to have survived disappointment, widowed, quiet-eyed, possessed of the kind of gentleness which does not arrive naturally but is carved slowly from grief. Telios began requesting lessons. This surprised everyone, most of all himself. He learned slowly, not because he lacked discipline, but because the harp required the use of feelings his education had taught him to store elsewhere. Yet he returned often, at first for music, then for conversation, and eventually for the increasingly unfamiliar experience of being somewhere no one expected him to become anything at all, but was still interested in what he was becoming. Prince Telios went to his first battle at 18, but returned an age beyond the usefulness of numbers. It had merely been a border raid that they had met with steel and blood, their bard now singing of their great success, for the kingdom. Maybe, but not for the peasants who now fed the crows. Beside him rose his master-at-arms, who had kept him safe when he froze, and later still when he had thawed. They had caught the raiders at a farmstead, or what was left of it, and he had seen what men would do when hungry, and all the appetites they had. He had sunk to madness then, and all that dragged him from it was the thought of being with Illyrica once again. and so he returned to sounds of triumph he did not hear or want, but was forced to endure. Men loudly explaining courage from positions of admirable safety. Celebrations and merriment that lasted 3 days or more, though for the widows somewhat less. The Queen watched from the palace balcony with relief so overwhelming it almost resembled joy. Almost, for relief and joy are cousins who frequently borrow one another's clothes, even though they never quite fit. She would have gone to him then, but much must be done. The city would celebrate for 3 days. She would see to that personally. And the widows, their grief eased with trinkets and words becoming of their husband's station. Teleos bowed then before the crowd, exactly as he had been taught, and the people roared and brayed, stamping hands and clapping feet, a many-headed thing of single mind and simpler thoughts. Yet all the while, all he could see was the peasant girl hanging from that leafless bough, the sight of her transfixing both his manhood and his boyhood friend. Clear, cold moments. Before the arrow pierced his friend's throat, before they looked into each other's eyes and grasped each other with their stare, and then fell like lovers, desperate, had either known a touch so tender, bar from their gentle mothers. Death's first kiss, before he had ever known life's first embrace. But here was no relief, no sating thrill, just sickening grief. Grief he filled with righteous vengeance, forever to his soul's corruption. It was only later the Queen had time to seek out her son. She searched first among the generals, then the chapel, then the western gardens where Teleos often walked when troubled. But it was from the old music tower that she eventually heard the harp. Softly, not performing, not entertaining, simply present, an embodiment of a feeling. The Queen climbed the narrow spiral stair in silence, bar the noise her shoes made upon the steps, laboured breathing from her breast, pulse racing with exertion, or with trepidation. And there, through half-open door, she saw them. The harpist sat beside the fire in a plain dark gown which she shapely filled. Her harp now abandoned quietly near the window, her hair cascading down. Teleos knelt before her. Not as princes kneel to crowns, nor soldiers to their commanders, nor men before their gods, but as exhausted children kneel when they have carried something heavy, not daring to complain. His breastplate lay discarded upon the floor. One gauntlet still hung stubbornly from his wrist, while the woman worked gently at its straps. There was blood upon him, not all of it his own. A wooden bowl of darkened water rested nearby. Lavender and cloves framed the room as she slowly, reverently, lovingly cleaned the corruption from his hands, as though trying to persuade violence that it had mistaken the address. Teleos was crying. Not loudly, not beautifully, not nobly. The way men cry when something inside them finally understands it is not going to survive unchanged. "I killed them all," he whispered, and then even quieter. "I could not save them. I could not save him." The woman said nothing, only rested her forehead lightly against his, as she cradled his heart within her own, daring not to speak, lest she drop it with thoughts of herself. He breathed her in and felt the terrible relief of no longer carrying himself alone. And after a long while, he kissed her. Not hungrily, not triumphantly, but with the terrible gentleness of someone starving for permission to remain himself. She denied him nothing then, and love's first embrace mingled with death's first kiss. And then she wept too, quietly, as widows do when they recognize war returning for another generation. At first, Queen Niobe felt numb, then jealousy, sharp and immediate. For he had come here, not to her, not to his mother, not to the woman who had carried him, raised him, protected him, and built her entire life around the terrible architecture of his survival, but to this older woman with half-calloused fingers and love in her eyes. It would have been better if she had found her son between the legs of a chambermaid in passion's embrace, the girl straightening her skirts afterward, curtsying, returning to her duties, with no more damage done than untidy linen. But this was no conquest. This was surrender. And there, watching her son collapse into another woman's tenderness, Queen Niobe felt something inside herself fracture quietly. Not because he loved, but because he had sought comfort somewhere beyond her reach. And because some part of her, the frightened part, the ruling part, understood immediately what kingdoms do to men who place love before duty.
A heart made room for Teleos to breathe beneath the crown. He found a place that asked no more and laid his burden down. He rode to war a boy in mail and came back old with grief. The crowd sang loud of victory, he heard the widows weep. His love washed blood from both his hands and held what war had torn. He found a home beyond the queen and kissed her battle worn. Stood hidden by the door, her breath made sharp by fear. She watched him kneel beyond her reach, nor dared to venture near. She'd built her life around his breath and guarded every year. But when he broke beneath the weight, another held him near. For love can loosen duty's chains and make the mighty kneel. She feared the heart he gave away, she feared the love he could not rule. Her fear of love made real